Well, hello everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Phaedra Johnson, and I am the Director of Research for the Amyloidosis Research Consortium, or ARC. Thank you for joining our ARC Talks webinar, which will be focused on clinical trial updates for the ATTR community. Our speaker for today's webinar is Kristen Hsu, who is ARC's Executive Director of Research. Kristen will be presenting important up-to-date information on the clinical trial landscape in ATTR amyloidosis, as well as the future direction of research. Kristen will present, and then we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. Please feel free to submit any questions into the Zoom question and answer option. Welcome to today's call, and I will now hand this over to Kristen, so thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen Hsu, and I'm the Executive Director of Clinical Research here at ARC. My background is actually in drug development. Before joining ARC more than 7 years ago, my career had been focused on planning and executing clinical trials across a number of different disease spaces. I worked for a number of years in Alzheimer's disease before moving into the rare and ultra-rare disease space. I loved working in rare disease because it gives you the opportunity to learn directly from patients in order to design your research. You need to understand what patients are going through, what their disease is, how they experience it, how that might be different from any other patient with the same disease, how they're impacted by it, and ultimately how we can learn from their perspectives to use them to better design clinical trials and develop effective treatments for patients. That's what drew me to ARC and what drives our initiatives today. A little bit about ARC before I get started. We are a patient-led, research-focused organization committed to collaboration across the drug development continuum. So efforts that accelerate the pace of discovery, expand patient access to the most effective care, and improve short and long-term outcomes. We partner with experts in industry, government, and academia to spark innovation and to bring promising treatments from lab to clinic. Our outreach and education inform and empower patients, families, caregivers, physicians, and researchers. We pride ourselves on being a science-based patient organization working to de-risk drug development by strategically implementing programs that we believe are critical to better care for patients and to facilitate and accelerate drug development in these rare diseases. All of our programs fall within one of our 4 areas of focus: improving the speed and accuracy of diagnosis, increasing our understanding of the disease, accelerating regulatory approval and reimbursement of effective treatments for patients, and enhancing the care and quality of life for patients and caregivers throughout their amyloidosis journey. Now, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors and donors for supporting today's ARC's talks and all of our programs. We couldn't do this work without you and continue to help patients without your support. And so thank you to each and every one of you. Now, I'm excited today to share some updates on some of the trials that have been going on in TTR amyloidosis. We'll plan to post this webinar on our website after it's done, so you'll be able to access the content and refer back to it whenever you need. We'll also plan for a separate ARC Talks webinar that will focus specifically on AL amyloidosis for those patients with AL. Now, before we dive directly into the trials, I want to take just a few minutes to discuss what clinical trials are and some of the key pieces of information that you should take into account when considering whether or not to participate in a trial. Now, clinical trials, or sometimes called clinical studies, are a type of research that evaluate whether a medical strategy, drug, treatment, or device is safe and effective for patients. Studies can also look at other aspects of care, like improving quality of life for patients, or even just seeking to generate data that helps us better understand how a disease progresses over time. There are 2 main types: interventional trials, which involve the administration of some type of intervention and is given, and researchers look at the outcomes in patients of that intervention, and then observational trials, where patients are observed over a period of time and their outcomes are measured. Clinical trials are classified into different stages called phases. Now, phase 1 is typically your smallest studies that are looking to determine a safe dose of a treatment and monitor how the treatment affects the body. Phase 2 is where you'll move into slightly larger numbers of patients, really looking to determine if a new treatment is seemingly effective, potentially identify a dose or select a dose and monitor any side effects. And then phase 3 is where you move into a larger group of patients to confirm how well a treatment works, monitor side effects, potentially compare the new treatment with a current standard of care or control arm in a randomized controlled study. And then phase 4 studies are typically post-regulatory approval, where you're gathering more information on a drug or a treatment after it's been marketed to see its effect in different populations and any side effects associated with long-term use. Now, it's really important to note that there is no single or linear roadmap to developing a new drug. Just as some drugs will need multiple studies within each phase, it's also possible to combine some phases within a single trial. This is especially true in rare disease, where there are so few patients and these diseases are so complex. Now, most trials are interventional and thus require the administration of a study drug or a treatment and a series of visits to specialized and trained study centers or sites for tests to monitor the effects of the drug. Some studies do allow for some of these tests and visits to be carried out as home health visits, where trained nurses can carry out the monitoring in your home if you choose, but the majority are going to be at a study site. Depending on the study size, there might be only 1 or 2 study sites across the US, or there could be many. You'll need to consider how difficult or easy it might be for you to travel to a study site and to do so repeatedly during the course of a study. Many study sponsors are able to support travel costs associated with study visits, but this is something you should ask about specifically if you're considering enrolling in a trial. Most visits can be conducted in a single day, but there are some that might require overnight stays. And so it's important to ask about this upfront and understand what the commitment will be. Trials for TTR amyloidosis commonly require clinical examinations, including checking your vital signs, reviewing your medications and any side effects you might be experiencing or new symptoms of your disease, blood and urine collections, questionnaires called patient-reported outcome measures, or PROs, that may ask you about your symptoms and how your disease is impacting your quality of life, functional tests. A common one is the 6-minute walk test, which is a test that measures how well your heart is functioning, and imaging tests like ECGs, echoes, and if you have heart involvement, particularly cardiac MRI or nuclear PET scans. Not every test is performed at every visit, but most will be done at least once at the beginning of the study during what's called a screening phase to see if you qualify, and will then be repeated regularly throughout the duration of the trial, some of them more frequently than others. Now, whether or not to participate in a clinical trial is a very personal decision and one to consider carefully with your doctor and your trusted loved ones. There are a number of benefits to participating in clinical trials, including the opportunity to be treated with investigational drugs that might not be available anywhere else. Patients participating in amyloidosis clinical trials receive regular and standardized care from trained research teams that specialize in amyloidosis. Visiting these expert centers through clinical trials can offer an amazing opportunity to learn more about your disease, how to manage it, particularly if you aren't able to see experts as part of your regular care. Furthermore, by participating in research, some patients really benefit from the sense that they're helping others by helping scientists better understand their disease, helping them advance treatments, and potentially helping them discover ways to prevent it in the future. Now, with all that said, just as there are potential benefits, there are also potential risks to participating in clinical trials, and it's important to understand what those might be for each trial. Clinical trials might involve large time commitment and can be very inconvenient with the time and effort traveling and taking part in each visit. There may be risks associated with not only the study drug, but all risks that are both known and unknown if it's a new drug, but also risks associated with the procedures themselves. If the trial involves an experimental or investigational drug, it might not work. Those who receive it might not get any benefit from it, or any benefit over the standard of care that would be regularly offered to them. Depending on the trial, participants might be randomly assigned to receive a standard treatment or a placebo, which is a treatment that has no active properties like a sugar pill or saline solution. And participants won't know of this assignment until the trial is completed. Now, the possible benefits and risks for each trial will be explained to participants in detail through a process called informed consent. And you'll have the opportunity to use that time to ask questions that will help you make the best decisions for yourselves. Now, for the remainder of my time, I'm going to review some of the key interventional clinical trials that are going on in ATTR amyloidosis. I won't review every trial, but I'm going to focus on the trials that involve novel therapies for TTR. Now, before we talk about treatments, I want to just quickly review the TTR amyloidosis disease pathway. Now, your liver produces the majority of your transthyretin protein, or TTR, which is intended to transport thyroxine, the thyroid hormone, and retinol, vitamin A, through the body. Now, in its native state, it's typically made up of subunits, 4 subunits that combine into this 4-part tetramer that you see here. In TTR patients, the TTR tetramer becomes unstable, either by genetic mutation, if you have hereditary TTR amyloidosis, or due to age in wild-type TTR amyloidosis. And it dissociates into these 4 subunits or monomers. The monomers then misfold and aggregate into amyloid fibrils, which deposit on your organs. And so this is how the disease works. And it's important to understand this pathway in order to understand the different treatments that are currently in development for TTR amyloidosis. Now, knockdown agents are designed to inhibit the production of the TTR protein in the liver, thereby reducing the overall levels of TTR in the body, preventing amyloid from building up and causing end organ damage. This box here shows you the different treatments that are currently approved or in development for the current approved knockdown or in development agents for TTR amyloidosis. So the ones in blue are approved for hereditary TTR amyloidosis. These are all currently gene silencers: Vutrisiran, Inotersen, Vutrisiran, and Eplontersen. 2 of these gene silencers, Vutrisiran and Eplontersen, are currently being studied for TTR with cardiomyopathy, whether it's wild type or hereditary. And then NTLA-2001 is a gene editor that we'll talk about in later slides. Now, your TTR stabilizers are going to be your drugs that bind to the TTR protein and actually prevent it from misfolding and subsequently forming into amyloid fibrils. Tafamidis today is the only drug that is approved that is a TTR stabilizer. It's currently approved for patients with TTR cardiomyopathy. Diflunisal is an NSAID that has similar properties to tafamidis, stabilizing properties. And then Acoramidis is a TTR stabilizer that is currently under investigation for TTR cardiomyopathy. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And tolcapone is another stabilizer that has the potential benefit of crossing the blood-brain barrier for patients with leptomeningeal involvement in TTR amyloidosis. Now, the last group of agents are your anti-fibril agents. And so these are typically going to be monoclonal antibodies that have the ability to target a specific protein or harmful cell in your body. In this case, the TTR protein and amyloid pre-existing amyloid deposits. So these would actually help remove the amyloid that is existing within the body. And so there are 3 investigational anti-fibril agents that are currently in clinical trials that we'll talk about later: Coramitug, Alexion-2220, and AT-02, all of which are in clinical development for patients with TTR amyloidosis. So this slide is one that we're going to come back to a few times moving forward. On this slide, you can see all of the drugs that have been approved or are currently in development for treatments with TTR amyloidosis and where they stand within clinical trials. I've got them broken up so that there's the stabilizers up top, your TTR stabilizers, tafamidis, acoramidis, and tolcapone. The knockdown agents, including patisiran, vutrisiran, a follow-up product to vutrisiran, ALN, TTR, SC04, Inotersen, Eplontersen, and NTLA-2001. And then their anti-fibril agents, Coramitug, Alexion-2220, and AT-02. And on the right, you can see where they stand in terms of development in clinical trials. So the ones that are your orange bars are going to be the drugs that are currently approved for at least one indication within TTR amyloidosis. And the blue bars show where they are for the investigative treatments, where they are in terms of clinical trials. So you can see we've got a number of drugs that are currently in phase 3, which is really exciting. Some other drugs that are approaching phase 3 and some earlier phases in phase 1 as well. And so we're going to start by looking at the trials that are currently recruiting for patients with TTR amyloidosis. And these are the 2 that are outlined in red here. So starting with NTLA-2001 and Alexion-2220. And so we'll start with NTLA-2001. So the MAGNITUDE trial is a large phase 3 study evaluating the safety and efficacy of NTLA-2001, which is a gene editor in adult patients with TTR cardiomyopathy, both wild type and hereditary or variant TTR. And so you'll see up here, NTLA-2001 is a gene editor that uses the CRISPR Cas9 technology. So this is a drug that's actually going to stop your body from producing the genetic code that would then go on, or delete the genetic code that would go on to create the TTR protein. And so your body will it'll reduce the overall levels of TTR in your body. And so I mentioned that this is going to look at the efficacy, the safety and efficacy of NTLA-2001 in patients with wild type and hereditary TTR cardiomyopathy. But before we get into how it does that, I just want to make sure everybody understands what is meant when we say it's going to evaluate the efficacy of this study drug. Efficacy is the ability of a drug to produce a desired effect in expert hands and under ideal circumstances. And so it's measured by whether a patient feels better, functions better, or lives longer. And so this study is going to evaluate whether NTLA-2001 works by assessing whether treatment with it reduces the risk of cardiovascular related events like death, urgent heart failure visits, and cardiovascular hospitalizations. Now, each of the studies that I'm going to review today have dozens of specific criteria that patients need to meet in order to be eligible for them or qualify to enroll. It's not uncommon for studies to have 40 or more eligibility criteria. I won't have time to go over all of those eligibility criteria, and many of them are going to be ones that only your doctors can assess. And so I only plan on highlighting some of the key criteria for each study. Now, in order to qualify for this particular study, patients need to have a medical history of heart failure and have NT-proBNP levels greater than 1,000. And so NT-proBNP is a biomarker that is commonly used across different types of heart failure and cardiomyopathy. Amyloidosis specifically, TTR amyloidosis, is a measure of cardiac distress. Patients, and so you need to have NT-proBNP levels greater than 1,000 to qualify for this. You can't have had any treatments with TTR gene silencers over the past 12 months in order to qualify for this study. And so that's important to keep in mind if you're a patient who has hereditary TTR amyloidosis and currently being treated for polyneuropathy. In order to qualify for this study, you will not qualify if you've been treated with any TTR gene silencers over the past 12 months, and if you've had any prior experience with Vutrisiran or Eplontersen. If you're taking tafamidis, you'll need to be on stable doses prior to enrolling. So tafamidis is permitted, but it has to be on a stable dose before enrolling. Now, NTLA-2001 is administered as a one-time intravenous infusion, so directly into the vein. But it's important to note that not all patients are going to receive NTLA-2001 as part of the study. Patients will be randomly assigned by chance to receive either NTLA-2001 or placebo. So each patient who enrolls will have a 2 out of 3 chance, or 66% chance of being assigned to NTLA-2001, and a 1 out of 3, or 33% chance of being assigned to placebo. This is a double-blinded study, which means that neither the patients nor their study doctors will know whether they've been assigned to receive 2001 or placebo until the completion of the study. Participants who enroll won't know what their assignment is until the study is completed, which brings to the question of when will the study be completed? How long will it be? This is an event-driven study, meaning that the study won't complete until a certain number of cardiovascular events have occurred within the entire population of study participants. And so what that means is we don't know exactly how long it will take. It will continue until that certain number of events have occurred. Based off of our knowledge of the disease today and how frequently these types of events do occur across patients with TTR cardiomyopathy, we're estimating that every patient will be studied for at least 18 months, but participation could last up to 4 years in order for enough events to happen in order to assess for efficacy. And so by participating in the study, if you're one of the first patients who enrolls in the study, you might be on this study for a full 4 years before it completes. If you're one of of the last study patients to enroll, it could be as short as 18 months in order to accumulate enough events over all of the participants. Now, this study is going to enroll 765 patients across the world and is currently open in 5 countries. There will be additional countries that open and additional study sites that open. Having worked in clinical operations myself, I can say that sometimes it takes a full year to get some study sites activated. And so it's important to make sure that you're staying up to date on which study sites are open across different countries as the study is recruiting. In the US, there are currently 8 centers that are recruiting, but there will be additional centers opening over the next few months. And so please just make sure that you're checking frequently as to where these study sites are so that you can see which are the closest and easiest for you to access if you're interested in pursuing enrollment. And so that's the MAGNITUDE trial. We're going to move next to the Depleter trial. The DepleTTR-CM trial is another large phase 3 study evaluating the safety and efficacy of Alexion 2220, which is an amyloid-fibril depleter, a drug that targets the active removal of pre-existing amyloid and hopefully restoring heart function and elasticity in adult patients with ATTR cardiomyopathy, both wild type and hereditary or variant, like the MAGNITUDE trial. Now, like the previous trial, the Alexion 2220 study will evaluate whether Alexion 2220 works by assessing whether treatment with it reduces the risk of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular clinical events. This study will include patients with slightly more advanced cardiomyopathy than the prior trial did. So that, like the prior trial, you do need to have a history of heart failure, but you'll notice that the NT-proBNP requirements for the study are slightly higher. So they need to be over 2,000, whereas it was 1,000 for the prior study, for the MAGNITUDE-CM study. Patients will be able to enroll on this study even if they're currently receiving standard of care based off of whatever the local standard of care is in your region, but you can't have had any prior treatment with amyloid depleters in order to qualify. Alexion 2220 is administered as an IV infusion every 28 days or about every 4 weeks. And like the prior trial, not all patients who participate in this trial will receive Alexion 2220. Patients in this trial will also be randomized to receive either the study drug or placebo in a 2-to-1 fashion. So 2 out of 3 patients will receive Alexion 2220 and 1 out of 3 will receive placebo. This is also another double-blinded study, which means that neither patients nor their study doctors will know whether they've received the active or placebo treatment until the end of this study. Now, this study is going to continue until the last patient enrolled has completed 2 years of treatment, and it's anticipated that each patient will likely participate in the study for somewhere between 2 and 4 years. So again, if you're one of the first patients to enroll, you might be on the study until for about 4 years. If you're the last patient to enroll, you will be on the study for about 2 years' time. This study is going to enroll 1,000 patients across the world and is currently open in 15 countries with additional countries planned. And there are, as of earlier this week, 15 of the 39 planned centers in the US are currently enrolling, with additional centers opening over the next few months. So again, if this is a trial that you're interested in, that you think you might be a good candidate for, it's important to keep an eye on where those clinical trial centers are planned and keep an eye on when they are opening. So those are the 2 novel interventional trials for TTR amyloidosis that are recruiting today. But there are a number of trials that are currently ongoing that I want to highlight, as it's important to keep an eye on these over the next year or so. And these are all highlighted in red here on this slide. And we're going to walk through each one of them. We will start with the ATTRibute-CM study, which is the phase 3 study of Acoramidis, or AG10, which is a TTR stabilizer that was designed to mimic the stabilizing property of the TTR variant T119M. This is a large phase 3 study. It was a 2-part study, initially looking at the impact of Acoramidis on the 6-minute walk test at a 12-month time point, and then subsequently the impact on a combination of all-cause mortality, hospitalizations, NT-proBNP, and 6-minute walk test at 30 months. Now, while the first endpoint, 6-minute walk test at 12 months, did not demonstrate a benefit for Acoramidis over placebo, the study did continue for the full 30 months and demonstrated a significant treatment effect at that 30-month time point on the combination endpoint, which includes all-cause mortality and cardiovascular hospitalizations. The drug has been submitted to FDA for approval in patients with TTR cardiomyopathy, and the FDA is set to make a decision on whether or not to approve the drug, I believe, in November of 2024. So we should have a decision from FDA on this by the end of the year, and it poses as a potential additional treatment option for patients with TTR cardiomyopathy. Now, Vutrisiran is a gene silencer that is administered as a quarterly subcutaneous injection and is currently approved and available for treatment of patients with hereditary TTR amyloidosis polyneuropathy. It's also being studied in patients with TTR cardiomyopathy, both hereditary and wild type, in a large phase 3 study called the HELIOS-B study. This study is assessing whether treatment with Vutrisiran improves outcomes of all-cause mortality and recurrent cardiovascular events compared to placebo. The results from this study are expected to be shared any day now. They've indicated that the results will come out by the end of June, early July of 2024. So we should be hearing about this soon. If positive, the study is no longer recruiting, but if positive, the company will likely submit this drug to FDA for review by the end of 2024, and we would expect to have a decision from FDA as to whether or not to approve it for patients with TTR cardiomyopathy in late 2025. Now, Eplontersen is a gene silencer, another gene silencer that is administered as subcutaneous injections every 4 weeks. And like Vutrisiran, it is currently approved and available for the treatment with hereditary or variant TTR with polyneuropathy, but is also currently being studied in patients with TTR cardiomyopathy, both hereditary and wild type. This is in the study called the CARDIO-TTR-Transform study, which is the largest phase 3 study to date. I started my career in Alzheimer's disease and working on large phase 3 studies. And this study itself, more than 1,400 patients, is larger than the phase 3 studies I was working on 10 years ago. And so that's pretty remarkable to have a study of this size. The study is assessing whether treatment with Eplontersen improves outcomes of cardiovascular mortality and recurrent cardiovascular events compared to placebo with standard of care, and results from that study are expected to be shared in the 2025-2026 timeframe. So something to keep an eye on in terms of the results that come from that. Now, Coramitug, which has been previously referred to as NNC 60190001, Coramitug is its name moving forward, is an anti-amyloid monoclonal antibody that's designed to prevent new TTR amyloid fibril from forming and to clear previously deposited TTR amyloid present in the affected organs through a stimulation of antibody-dependent phagocytosis. So designed to have the body, so it targets the amyloid and then prompts the body to remove it itself through a natural process. It's currently being studied in patients with TTR cardiomyopathy in a phase 2 study, and we're expecting results from that study to come in the 2025 timeframe. And so if positive, would potentially advance through the development process, and there would be additional studies of Coramitug in TTR cardiomyopathy patients. So something to keep an eye on. And then the last drug that I'll mention in terms of keeping an eye on is AT02. This is another monoclonal antibody, but different from Coramitug or from Alexion 2220, which is a monoclonal antibody. This is designed to bind to and treat all types of systemic amyloidosis by stimulating the immune system to remove amyloid deposits. So it's initially being studied in a 3-part phase 1 study, which included both cardiac, AL, and TTR amyloidosis patients. The TTR cohort for this study has completed enrollment. It's currently still recruiting for AL patients, but we expect the results from that study to come in 2025. And again, if positive, would hope to see additional studies planned for AT02 in patients with AL and TTR amyloidosis. Like the other monoclonal antibodies, this is given as an IV infusion every 4 weeks. The current phase of the study that's ongoing, the third part of this 3-part study, is looking to evaluate the safety and tolerability of multiple doses of AT02 in patients, with the primary endpoint being primarily safety, so understanding treatment emergent adverse events, any dose-limiting toxicities, abnormal lab values, and treatment emergent anti-drug antibodies. And so again, this is a short initial study, but if the results are positive, potentially additional studies planned for AT02 in the future. And so lastly, there are some additional studies that are planned to take place in TTR amyloidosis that I want to highlight. These are not studies that are recruiting yet, but something that have been announced and something to keep an eye on. BridgeBio will be launching a phase 3 prevention study of Acoramidis, so TTR stabilizer, in adult ATTR carriers. So individuals who have a known genetic mutation for TTR amyloidosis but are not yet symptomatic. This will be the first prevention study that I'm aware of in the TTR space, and something that will be really exciting to see. There's a lot we don't understand yet about the early disease development, early disease activity in patients who are carriers. And so this will be a really important study to add to our understanding of how to best treat patients and when patients transition from an asymptomatic into a symptomatic stage. Now, Intellia has also shared that they're planning a study of NTLA-2001. So this is the gene editor CRISPR-Cas9 product in patients with TTR polyneuropathy. All of the trials that I've mentioned so far have been focused in cardiomyopathy. So I'm excited that this is the first one to highlight will be taking place in a polyneuropathy space. I do want to highlight, though, that this is going to be a smaller trial, and it's going to be open to study sites outside of the US, given the number of current standard of care, the current number of treatments that are available in the US for TTR polyneuropathy. This will be a study that takes place outside of the US, but it's an important step towards continuing drug development in the hereditary TTR polyneuropathy patient population. Now, that was a lot to go through in a short amount of time. It also represents only a small portion of the TTR amyloidosis trials that are currently recruiting. There are a number of observational studies, imaging trials, and single center trials that are recruiting or are planned that I have not gone over. A couple that I'll highlight that are non-interventional is this subclinical transthyretin cardiac amyloidosis study in V122 TTR carriers. So this is a study that is sponsored with funding from the NHLBI, National Blood Institute, through NIH. It's being done the PI is Dr. Justin Grodin out of UT Southwestern in Dallas, also being conducted with Matt Maurer in New York and Cleveland Clinic. It's looking to enroll patients who are carriers of V122I, both those who have developed symptoms and those who have not yet developed symptoms. It's really important to take a step back and recognize that not every patient who has a genetic mutation for hereditary TTR cardiomyopathy will actually go on to experience hereditary TTR cardiomyopathy. And so this study is going to recruit for carriers. And so it'll start by recruiting for carriers with no disease symptoms, looking to understand and identify when carriers of the V122I TTR mutation have early signs of heart disease. And then for carriers with symptoms, it'll look to generate data that will help us find ways to help physicians predict cardiovascular disease related to hereditary TTR cardiomyopathy and provide better care for these patients. And so this is a non-interventional study, but really so important in terms of understanding that early disease progression and identifying who will actually go on to develop ATTR cardiomyopathy. There are also a number of registries that are currently enrolling, planned. So the first I'll highlight is the Southeastern ATTR Amyloidosis Consortium study, the CTRAC family registry. This is a registry that's planned to be launched in the fall out of the Virginia Commonwealth University as the primary center, but there will be other centers in the Southeastern United States. A registry, for those who don't know, it's a research tool that collects information on the health of individuals with a particular disease over time. And so this particular study is looking to describe the clinical course of disease and outcomes for asymptomatic carriers of the V122I population. It's also going to look at asymptomatic carriers of the pathogenic TTR mutations and those who have other types of mutations for hereditary TTR cardiomyopathy amyloidosis. And so this is another really important study in terms of understanding that early disease progression. And then the last registry I'll highlight for our neighbors in the north is the Canadian Registry for Amyloidosis Research. This is a Canada-wide registry that captures information from people diagnosed with all types of amyloidosis. The information is used in a variety of different ways to improve amyloidosis care across Canada. And it has two parts. One is a direct-to-patient registry portal, as well as the option to have health data collected at one of 5 registry centers or clinics. There are a number of different sponsor or industry-sponsored registries as well. There are imaging trials looking at different molecular tracers that are currently being studied primarily at single-center trials right now. There are other single-center trials looking at different aspects of care, cardiovascular, pulmonary exercise testing, ultrasound, echo. And so there's a number of different trials that are ongoing right now that I won't have time to review, but it's important to make yourself aware of these if you're interested in participating in helping patients and researchers understand the disease. Which begs the question of how to find clinical trials. And so there are a few different ways to stay informed of trials if this is something that you're interested in. Clinicaltrials.gov is a publicly available and federally mandated national database of clinical trials. You can log on, anybody can access clinicaltrials.gov and search for recruiting trials in amyloidosis. I will give the caveat that it can be overwhelming. There are a number of if you do a quick search, you'll come up with, I think, like 400 trials that are recruiting in amyloidosis. And a lot of those are pulling from the term amyloid. And so might be actually referring to like Alzheimer's studies or other studies that are looking at other types of amyloid. And so you've got to be pretty narrow in terms of your search criteria if you're using clinicaltrials.gov. You can also talk to your healthcare providers about trials that you might be eligible for, making sure that they're aware that you are interested in participating and that they're staying up to date about different trial options. Great to connect with groups like ARC or ASG or other country-specific groups if you're outside of the US to make sure that you're staying informed of trials that are recruiting and results from the ongoing trials. And the last option that I'll mention is My Amyloidosis Pathfinder, or MAP. MAP is an online tool that ARC developed back in 2017 to help patients with amyloidosis get connected to treatment centers and clinical trials specific to their type of amyloidosis and symptoms. And so anybody can access MAP. And actually, we'll send, I don't think I can chat to the group, but we'll send an email with the link following it, with a link on how to access MAP. Patients and caregivers can create an account and be asked to sign up and answer a few questions about your amyloidosis. So what type you have, what organ involvement you have, your prior and current treatment history. And then once your profile is completed, you'll be able to find clinical trials that you might be eligible for based on how you answered that profile. And you'll also be notified. So you'll be notified instantly of which trials are currently recruiting that you might qualify for. And then moving forward, anytime a new trial opens that you might be a good candidate for, you'll receive an email notification asking you to log back in and check out the new trials that are recruiting. It is important to keep your profile up to date in MAP so that you're able to benefit from it as much as possible. It's always going to show you trials based off of your current profile criteria. And so if you're experiencing new organ involvement, if you didn't know what type you had when you made a profile, but you know now, if you've started a new treatment, it's important to keep that profile up to date so that you're benefiting from the tool as much as possible. You can also use MAP in order to connect with treatment centers and compare treatment centers to make sure that you are finding centers that are able to give you the best type of care that you need for where you are in your disease state. So you can compare what type of multidisciplinary teams centers have, access to specific testing, whether they've got genetic testing, imaging capabilities, nurse navigator, and see where these centers are in terms of like how close they are and compare them across one another. And so that is everything. We'll plan to do another presentation for AL amyloidosis patients within the next few months. And I think also plan to do this webinar several times throughout the year, knowing that new trials come up and things change very quickly in the TTR amyloidosis landscape. So I'll mention it before I take this slide down. There will be a post-webinar survey that goes out to everybody. If there's any feedback that you have as part of that, things that we can do to improve future webinars, information that would be helpful, please don't hesitate. But for now, like very excited to have had the chance to share this with you and take some of the Q&A that I see has come through the chat. So I'll turn off my screen.
Excellent. And thank you so much, Kristen. I mean, it is a very exciting time in ATTR research, and I know the community is really looking forward to seeing the results that are coming out of these studies. So just a reminder to all the participants, please feel free to continue to submit questions through the Q&A link at the bottom of the Zoom. We have a bunch of great questions to get through, Kristen, so I'll start. Just a couple quick points of clarification back to the webinar before we go into some of the other topics. But one question was, what was the study for hereditary ATTR carriers again?
Yeah, so Bridge Bio will be planning to start a prevention study for Acoramidis in patients who are hereditary TTR carriers. That study will start by the end of the year. It's not on clinicaltrials.gov yet, but it is planned for the end of the year. And so we certainly will share the news once that study does start, but it'll be an exciting option for patients or for individuals who are carriers of a genetic mutation.
Right. Thanks, Kristen. What is the definition of a knockdown TTR drug?
Yeah, so a knockdown TTR agent is one that actually limits the amount of TTR your body produces. And so there are two types of knockdown drugs that are currently being studied in TTR amyloidosis. There are gene silencers, which, and an example of a gene silencer would be Vutrisiran, Anti-Amyloid, Vutrisiran, Eplontersen. These are either antisense oligonucleotides or RNA interference drugs. And so they're drugs that actually if you take a step back in terms of how proteins are produced, your body first starts with a genetic code that is translated into RNA. Your RNA is then actually transcribed into and used to produce your proteins. And so gene silencers are ones that actually start at the RNA level. They interrupt the RNA transcription process so that your body doesn't produce the protein. So it never goes on to then misfold, to dissociate, misfold, and produce amyloid. So the gene silencers focus at the RNA level. NTLA-2001 is a genetic knockdown agent, and that it actually removes the snippet of DNA that would go on to actually translate into the RNA and form TTR. And so both act by essentially stopping your body from producing the TTR protein. at least in the liver in this case. And so those would be like what a knockdown agent is. But they work in two slightly different ways at different points on the protein production pathway.
Thank you. All right. Another question that came through is, does race have an impact on how someone responds to treatment? Is race used to determine a patient's treatment?
That is an excellent question. And I can only answer it by saying we don't know yet if it impacts it. It's certainly not being used right now to, I think, determine what treatment patients should be using. We just don't know enough yet about if there is an effect on how a patient experiences a disease and what treatment they might benefit from. And so this is a great example of where participating in some of these non-interventional studies, like the V122I carrier study or the C-TRAC family registry, are great opportunities to help the scientific community understand, because there are studies that are enrolling carriers, for example, patients that we know are at risk for developing the disease, but we don't know if they will develop the disease. It's a great opportunity to help us understand if race does play a factor, how it might play a factor, and then ultimately help us to be able to answer that question if it could be used to determine which treatment a patient might benefit from.
Thanks.
There's a lot we still don't know yet.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that same vein of observational studies, are there any prospective studies planned to look at the natural course of TTR from early diagnosis onward? So no intervention versus use of stabilizers, for example.
Yeah, so there's a number of different screening studies, I would say, that are currently ongoing, as well as like some of these like early diagnosis studies. So even that V122I study that I mentioned, it is looking for patients who actually, it's two parts. So it's one, looking for carriers who don't have symptoms, but also studying carriers who are diagnosed in the early stages to see how they go on to develop the disease. There are also screening studies that are looking to actually diagnose patients as part of this, and potentially even find them before they've got active disease. And so an example would be like Matt Maurer at Columbia has his the SCAN-MP study, which is looking at patients who are African-American, Caribbean, Hispanic, over the age of 65 with heart failure, and actually screening them to see if they might actually, one, be carriers of the V122I genetic mutation, and then two, if they've actually got evidence of amyloid deposition through PYP. And so again, it's looking to, one, identify patients who might not actually even know they have the disease, but then follow them through that early disease courses. There are also other studies planned looking at like spinal stenosis. And so we know that spinal stenosis is one of the early symptoms of TTR cardiomyopathy. So is it possible to look at patients who have spinal stenosis and identify through biopsy or through staining of material collected during the spinal stenosis procedure if they have amyloidosis, and follow them similarly with carpal tunnel. So there are a number of different options. It just takes a little bit of time to look for them. And so that's something that we can do to try to help keep people aware of what those options are and how to participate.
Great. And another question, actually, and this is a bit more on the international framework. Hello, thank you for such great information. Do the resources to find clinical trials show options for Latin American countries? If not, how can we participate?
Yeah. So absolutely, clinicaltrials.gov does show global research centers and how to contact those research centers. My Amyloidosis Pathfinder right now will display trials that are recruiting globally. We don't have it currently set up to necessarily show recruiting treatment centers globally. And so that's something that we hope to be able to improve on in the functionality moving forward, but it's not there currently. I would say staying in touch with like local support group organizations, like other patient organizations within your country is a great opportunity to stay informed as well. But clinicaltrials.gov does show global options in terms of recruiting for trials.
Thanks, Kristen. And I know we're coming up on time here, so maybe just one more question. There are certainly some others who we can certainly follow up separately after this. But so one question that came through, are there any clinical trials coming up for early ATTR looking to prevent heart involvement?
So the Bridge Bio study, the prevention study, would be the one that I would mention. It's going to be specific for patients who are carriers of a TTR mutation. I don't think there are no studies that I'm currently aware of looking at preventing wild type TTR amyloidosis. I think there's still so much that we don't understand yet about why somebody gets wild type TTR amyloidosis, who those patients might be. And we need to understand that in order to be able to design a study on how to actually prevent the disease. And so I'm not aware of any currently, but again, these other studies that are really looking, observational studies, registries, participating in those efforts are going to be the ones that enable those broad scale, like TTR wild type prevention studies in the future. So.
Well, I think we'll end there, Kristen. Any follow-up notes that you want to share with the group before we end the call?
I don't think so. We will make this presentation available. And like I said, we're hoping to do this a few times of the year so that as new trials come up, new data is shared, everybody can stay informed. We'll also look at if there's a way to kind of share this through either handouts on the website so that that's easily available at any time that you can go and access it instantly. So, but if you ever have any questions, we've got, dedicated support people here at ARC that are able to help you navigate this, answer whatever questions we have. If, as always, I'll mention signing up for my amyloidosis Pathfinder. It's a great way to stay informed of trials, and the first step towards participating one if it's something that you're interested in. So thank you, everyone. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.